This is The Conspiracy of Man, a video series about Jesus the man. Not Jesus the Christ or anointed God of Christian myth, but Jesus the man, who he actually was and what he actually did. The Conspiracy of Man is a story about the Essene conspiracy to bring down the temple using Jesus to fulfill the laws of the blood sacrifice, ancient laws ostensibly established by Moses with Yahweh. By offering himself up as the final blood sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb, Jesus brought into question the entire sacrificial system. This is video 12 in the series. It is the story of Yeshu, the spiritual master. Yeshu was what would be called in other cultures a spiritual master. His training at the Nazarene monastery involved a very different kind of training, both in the known and unknown world. Such masters have been noted in many cultures throughout history, and there are many stories of such masters being noted for various unusual powers over their environment, among these being the control over local weather events and animals. They are also sometimes noted for their ability to heal. According to gospel tradition, Yeshu exhibited unusual powers to some degree. However, unlike Christianity, other cultural traditions recognizing these acts do not attribute them to any god, but to the Master himself, and that is where Christianity differs. The Gospel narrative, of John in particular, defines Yeshu as a god. Another distinguishing mark of the spiritual master is teaching through storytelling. In Yeshu's case, this was seen in his parables. Such stories or parables are designed to address a specific person or group at a specific time in a specific place and within a specific culture. That is why such stories often make no sense to people operating outside that specific time, place, and culture where the story is told. The Sufi master, Jalal al-Din Rumi, used poetry to teach. He was once asked how and why he became such a profound writer of romantic or love poetry. He replied he never liked poetry much and, had it been up to him, he would have preferred to use other teaching methods. However, poetry was what the people of his time, place, and culture resonated with, so he began using poetry as a teaching tool. Such are the ways of the master. A spiritual master will say there is indeed a divine presence which they operate under and within. However, they do not link this presence to the traditional idea of a religious god. Yet, these masters often operate under various religious guises. As they say, religion is a good start, but one must move beyond religion if they are to progress upon the path of enlightenment. Yeshu used his skills as a master and his authoritative power as a priest to get people to listen to his message about their temple and its laws, ostensibly dictated by Yahweh. And herein lies the fundamental key to the entire gospel story. Yeshu's only concern was for his people, the lost sheep of Israel. These were temple followers oppressed by sacrificial taxation. There was a saying from that era that went thus: "A man worked one day to pay his rent, one day to pay his taxes, one day to feed his family. The rest of his effort went to the temple." This meant that out of a 6-day work week, half a man's productive effort went to feed temple coffers. The fact was, the temple's sheep were lost to an utterly corrupt religion that caused much misery and suffering among its followers. How much? Temple law had people entombing loved ones alive to avoid a very expensive religious purification ritual called the Para Aduma. Yeshu's stance on whom he was addressing was stated quite clearly in Matthew 10:5, quote, "These 12 Jesus sent forth, and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." End quote. Yeshu commanded his disciples. He did not hint or ask politely. He commanded the disciples to stay away from the Gentiles and everyone else that had no need to hear his message of redemption from the law's sacrificial tribute. Obviously, there would be no need for anyone operating outside the temple, like the Samaritans, to hear his message as they were not subject to temple law. To further make his point, Yeshu provides a lesson to his disciples about disobeying his command. The lesson to his disciples is told through the story of a Canaanite woman who, in typical patriarchal fashion, again remains unnamed. The story must be first set in context. Yeshu is sitting talking to his disciples, listening intently to his words, when two of them enter with a Gentile, a Canaanite woman, concerned about her daughter's devilish problem. At this point, the woman has been pleading with the disciples for an audience with Yeshu. Finally, out of exasperation, the disciples take her to Yeshu. Despite his command not to deal with Gentiles or anyone else that is not a member among Temple's followers, the disciples try weaseling out of the situation by blaming the woman for pestering them to this point, begging Yeshu to, quote, "Send her away, for she crieth after us." End quote. The woman then states her case, quote, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou Son of David, my daughter is grievously vexed with a devil." Initially, Yeshu refuses to speak to the woman. Then comes the perfect moment for Yeshu to restate his command to the disciples, quote, "I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." End quote. Now comes the lesson. The woman begins worshiping Yeshu, meaning she is groveling before him when she says, quote, "Lord, help me." End quote. Yeshu responds, quote, "It is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs." End quote. In other words, it does not serve to provide Gentiles with the spiritual nourishment of the children's bread, as they have no need for it. This is a significant comment, and virtually everyone reading this thinks Yeshu is calling the woman a dog to her face. But in fact, he is indirectly addressing his disciples using the kind of local vernacular they would use to describe Gentile women, saying, "Idiots, how many times must I command you to stay away from these Gentiles you call dogs? I told you several chapters back, I'm only here for the lost sheep of Israel. What part of that command don't you understand?" Then the woman pulls off a masterstroke saying, quote, "Truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered and said unto her, "O woman, great is thy faith. Be it unto thee even as thou wilt." Yeshu is telling his disciples that even this Gentile dog has greater faith in his commands than his loyal disciples. Quote, "And her daughter was made whole from that very hour." What Yeshu is saying to the woman is, my people following temple law have greater need for my attention than a Gentile woman who has no need to hear my words. Note the woman's reference to Yeshu as a son of David. King David was considered an Aaronic high priest on the order of Melchizedek. The essential idea of a priest is one who represents God on earth. Therefore, priests of that era were considered sons of God, whose word spoke for God. Thus, this king, loyal to Yahweh, represented himself as a priest, just as other men claiming to represent Yahweh's authority were called priest. In his day, Melchizedek was the divine high priest, or Kohen Gadol. Abraham recognized him as such with his tithing of the war booty gained in the battle with Sodom's king Bera. David assumed certain priestly functions, like referencing the Ark and Solomon at the consecration of the temple. Thus, a woman's reference to King David indicates the office of a priest. Thus, this statement says the woman recognizes Yeshu's status as that of a temple priest. This is perhaps the very first story of a teledistancing cure. However, we never know for sure because there was no follow-up on the results. Once again, the upshot of this story is that Yeshu's only concern is for his people, those temple followers lost to their corrupt religion. Gentiles need not apply. There are people that deny the existence of Yeshu, citing the fact that no noted author, historian, or pundit of the day commented on his supposed larger-than-life presence. They are wrong in that supposition, as there were a few writers and historians that did write about Yeshu's historical presence. What is truly remarkable is that anyone wrote anything about him at all. Why didn't more people write about Yeshu? Why wasn't he noticed far and wide for all his fabulous acts? Why was his name not on everyone's lips and at the tip of their pens? The answer is quite simple. In his day, Yeshu was a nobody, a persona non grata, an ignored character in Rome's grand history. The reason almost no one noticed Yeshu's historical presence is because his story was not interesting to anyone outside the temple's religious confines. To get a better understanding of the situation, picture a noted author or historian scrambling to cover a story about a local Methodist preacher disputing church doctrine with a neighboring Catholic sect. Hardly a story that would stop the presses. Yeshu's name did not go up in lights until Christians put it there, well after his death. That is why no one bothered to write about Yeshu. His story wasn't interesting to anyone not concerned with matters peculiar to the Second Temple and its laws. If one desires to get a really big yawn from a crowd, just start writing about the law. Christians today consider the temple to be naught but a minor footnote in Yeshu's story, when it is in fact the entire story. The fact remains, Yeshu wasn't even a minor nuisance within Rome's historical framework. Witness Pilate washing his hands of the minor problem brought before him so he could move on with important business. We move now to the story of Yeshu's Sermon on the Mount, or Sermon on the Plain, depending on which version one reads. The multitude. Gospel authors display a penchant for fantastic hyperbole. This is most evident in stories where Yeshu is dealing with large numbers of people that showed up for an event. The first thing that needs to be remembered was that Yeshu clearly stated he had only come for the lost sheep of Israel, meaning temple Jews lost to their utterly corrupt religion. The temple was located in Jerusalem. Galilee, had a large population of Gentiles. The question then is how many people in that northern region would be interested in hearing Jesus preach about temple law. Of course, Christian revisionists corrupted the message so it appears Yeshu is addressing worldly matters that concern everyone, including Gentiles. First, there is the physical reality of the story. Yeshu is addressing thousands of people at these rallies. Have you ever been to an open-air gathering with thousands of people in attendance? Those who have attended such an event realize the impossibility of anyone hearing Yeshu's words unless they are sitting very close to his person. This is why public address systems were invented. So what were these thousands of people there for when they could not even hear what was being said? Again, Yeshu was only there to address matters of the temple priest's corruption of the law. His focus on this matter is quite clear when he states, quote, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For verily I say unto you, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle shall in no wise pass from the law, till all be fulfilled." End quote. Fulfillment of the law will come in the form of Yeshu's blood sacrifice that fulfills religious contractual law, ending the covenant between temple Jews and Moses' original agreement written in blood with the temple god, Yahweh. Framing Yeshu's words in that context clarifies the meaning behind them. Outside of perhaps a few curious listeners, Yeshu's only interested audience consisted of temple Jews. Understanding his words in the proper context clarifies those issues being addressed in Yeshu's TED Talks from the mountain. The longest section of the sermon is Matthew 5:17, traditionally referred to as the antitheses. Here, Yeshu reinterprets the Old Covenant, in particular its commandments, referring to them as what you have heard from others. Yeshu advises turning the other cheek and to love one's enemies, in contrast to taking an eye for an eye. According to most interpretations of Matthew 5:17, Yeshu's new teachings, bringing about salvation from temple law, support the original law. This is because for Yeshu's message to work, it had to remain commensurate and within the legal confines of sacrificial law. Therefore, he had to frame his message in such a way that it did not present complete refutation or outright opposition to the law. There are numerous gospel stories where Yeshu refers to one's neighbors, to wit, Mark 12, quote, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," end quote. Then there is Matthew 22:37, quote, "Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." End quote. What Yeshu is saying is that, if one treats their Jewish neighbor as they would treat themselves, there is no need for the 613 commandments, or mitzvot, specified by sacrificial law. This, of course, fails to recognize how shabbily people often treat themselves. When one fully appreciates the racial and cultural clannishness of first-century Temple Jews, it should be obvious that the only people Temple Jews would consider their neighbors were other Temple Jews. Knowing this puts a new light on what a temple priest like Yeshu is telling fellow Temple Jews about loving their neighbor. Why? Because there would be obvious enmity between various members within this tightly knit group of adherents to the religion. What Yeshu refers to in this diatribe are cultural traits instilled in temple followers, for instance, to hate one's Jewish neighbor while seeking retaliation with equal vengeance to a perceived wrong, such as an eye for an eye. This was the religious and cultural tradition of Temple Judaism. Again, these are matters of temple law Yeshu addresses, matters that are of no concern to anyone else, especially Gentiles living far outside the temple's sacrificial system. The inclusion of Gentiles in the story is due to later Christian revisionist attempts to turn Yeshu's historical legacy into a universal religion ruled by a magical, mystical God they called Jesus. The issue Saul faced was there were simply not enough temple Jews to flesh out the religious flocks he intended to shepherd. Note: while video and audio contain AI elements, script content is completely human-generated. There is no AI-generated script or script editing included in the narration.